Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do, one colleague to another. Hello, everybody, and welcome to CDP's Practical for Your Practice. I'm Carin Lefkowitz, one of your hosts for today, and I'm joined by my pal, Kevin Holloway. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Carin. How are you?
I'm great. I am really excited about this episode. I might nerd out a little bit. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm not, I guess, an expert in the topic we're going to talk about today, so I probably won't nerd out as much, but I think all of us get our opportunity, right? We've all had our chance to nerd out, so this is yours.
True. And you might find by the end of today that you're a nerd too.
I'm a nerd in lots of ways, and maybe I can just add this to my resume of what to be a nerd about.
Well, I'll tell everybody that I'm really excited because we are talking to somebody who I've wanted to talk to for a long time, Dr. Allison Harvey, who's going to talk to us about cognitive interventions and understanding cognitive components of insomnia, which is so cool and right up my nerd alley. So I'm really excited about that. But before we jump into that, we actually have a really nice piece of listener feedback that I would love to share if you're okay with that.
Yeah, please.
So I'm going to shorten what was actually said a little bit because I promised the person that I would take out some of the most identifying details of what they said. But this feedback really hit to me. So it's from Randy in New York.
Hi, Randy.
And he wrote, "So this morning I was taking a brisk walk on a gorgeous sunny day. Your podcast started playing, and it was the episode, The Club Nobody Wants to Join. Mm-hmm. Carin, I'm so sorry about the loss of your brother by suicide. I'm in that sad club too, as my aunt died by suicide while in a psychiatric ward while on suicide watch." And you know, I'd say, yep. "Later in my career, I had a short stint running a crisis center that answered calls for 988. So I became a mini expert on suicide assessment and prevention and really have taken that mission into the remainder of my career. I'm still listening to this episode, but the personal aspects of your journey, Carin, and the other speakers were touching. Good on you for covering this vital topic."
That's really great.
Yeah. Thank you, Randy.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, that's so meaningful. I'm sorry you're part of this bad, awful club too. Mm-hmm. But I really appreciate your feedback. Obviously, it was a really personal episode for me, and the point was to impact people, so I hope that it did that.
I will say, for my part, I was not there on the episode, but of course, listening to it, helping with the post-production of it, it was a really, really touching episode too. So I hope folks who are listening maybe take a chance to go back and listen to that one. That was episode, I think, 3 of this season.
Yeah.
So check it out. It really was really very approachable and very, resonating, meaningful. So thanks for sharing, Carin, on that episode too. But thanks for sharing the feedback as well.
Thank you to everybody who listened. And if it moved you as it resonated with you, we always want to hear from you. And we always want to hear from you about every episode. So please don't be shy, and we'll give you info on how to connect with us at the end of today's episode.
Yep.
But on a brighter note, let's move in to today's topic.
Let's nerd out.
Let's nerd out. As we said, we are joined by Dr. Allison Harvey, just a huge name in the field of insomnia work, and particularly cognitive strategies for understanding and treating insomnia. And we're so thrilled to have you here as our guest today. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you, Carin and Kevin. I'm super excited to be here and to talk about one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, I gather you're a sleep nerd with me. You're probably even a bigger sleep nerd than I am.
Yep, I'm a big sleep nerd, and it is fun. I mean, we all spend a third of our lives doing this, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
It's fascinating when it goes poorly, but it's really nicely when the sleep is going well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, maybe you can take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us our listeners a little bit about your background.
Sure. So my name is Allison Harvey. I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. I did my training in Australia. Hopefully you can still hear my accent. I'm
We can.
born and
Yes.
bred Australian. And I spent about 6 years at the University of Oxford in the UK. That's where I started working on sleep. And I haven't looked back, moving over here to UC Berkeley. Yeah, I think that's all.
I mean, now I just want to ask a bunch of questions about how you ended up in California from Australia, which, is a phenomenal place, but we can do that on a different episode. But maybe the next thing to cover is what it is that just an introduction to what it is that we're going to be talking about, which is essentially what role cognitions play in insomnia, because I think that for many of us who've been trained in sleep before and insomnia treatment, many of us are very familiar with the behavioral aspects of it, the interventions, the conceptualization, and there have been some studies that show that is possibly the most powerful part of cognitive behavioral treatment for insomnia. But that means that we often kind of ignore, or at least don't talk enough, I think, about the cognitive aspects. So maybe you can start just by telling us why you think that's important.
Yeah, of course. Well, the core idea is that insomnia for many patients isn't just a behavioral problem. It's often kept going by vicious cycles of unhelpful thinking, unhelpful beliefs, and other unhelpful cognitive processes that we'll talk about today, I think, and that also play a role in perpetuating insomnia. And in the research, in a study that my team did with Charles Morin's team at the University of Laval in Canada, we compared cognitive therapy alone versus behavior therapy versus their combination. And we saw that actually all three arms worked, and the combination did the best. Cognitive therapy alone was slower to work, but it lasted longer. And behavior therapy alone was quicker to work, but didn't last quite as well. So, the cognitive therapy part is later to the game in insomnia treatments. That was 2014, whereas the behavioral approaches were developed back in the late 70s and early 80s. So this is sort of newer. So I think that that's why we don't tend to kind of talk about it as much or know about it quite as much. But I think we've all had patients where the cognitive piece is really obvious. And we also all have had patients who don't feel comfortable doing sleep efficiency training, maybe stimulus control, although that one's easier to get buy-in. And of course, it might be that stimulus control and sleep restriction actually operate via a cognitive mechanism. We may or may not get to that, but so I think there's many interesting pieces around the cognitive processes in insomnia.
It's fascinating to me, especially kind of the way, Carin, you introduced it, that we maybe focus a lot on behavioral interventions with insomnia, perhaps more, and pay less attention to the cognitive processes. But even just Dr. Harvey, as you're talking about, maybe the longevity after the different interventions, it's fascinating to me. And I sat here thinking, I'm not a sleep nerd yet. I'm working on it. And I was even thinking, for the average person, before I was at least, more familiar with the work that Carin and colleagues here at CDP do around cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia and work like that. I mean, I think maybe I'm representing the ignorant average provider out there. I think a lot of what I assumed notions were like, well, they need to get on, some kind of medication, or we need to do, at best things like, set up the sleep environment, so that almost like focusing most on physiological processes as being the most important. So it was interesting. I appreciate you kind of outlining how the cognitive portion is so important, just because I don't know that folks who are not focused on being sleep nerds like you all are, and I hopefully am becoming, even think about.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And, I think the tendency at this point in history is to reach for the primary care provider and get some medications. And it's an interesting story in the insomnia field. Just, practice parameter after practice parameters, best case papers all recommend CBTI as the frontline treatment for insomnia. And there's a time and a place for medications, but typically it's for short-term use, and in certain circumstances, because it is just so effective to be targeting the cognitive and behavioral processes. I mean, it's really a success story in our field, how much progress people can make, and quite quickly, when we work with them on the cognitive and behavioral processes contributing to insomnia.
Let me ask you this then. So you talked about kind of the cognitive processes that are, that's really, really important. We really need to address those in addition to the behavioral aspects. Like, what are we talking about? What are some of the common cognitive, I don't know, processes or things people are doing cognitively that can be problematic to their healthy sleep?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few. Maybe I can kind of zoom in on 4.
Okay. Yeah.
First of all, there's worry and rumination, or general kind of negatively toned thought. And so that's sort of daytime worries about being tired and not coping, or it's nighttime worries about not falling asleep and what tomorrow's going to look like. The problem with this kind of negative thinking is that it causes arousal and the kind of fight-flight response, and that's the opposite of what we need in order to fall asleep. So that's a big one. A second one that is, I think when you start looking for it, you see it. We call it selective attention and monitoring for sleep-related threats. So this is kind of the automatic scanner we tend to have on when we're concerned about our sleep. So we might scan our bodies for signs of tiredness. We might scan the environment and be very sensitive to things in the environment that might disrupt our sleep, such as, the tiny sound of a dripping tap becomes a kind of a deafening sound, or, monitoring the clock, or monitoring body sensations for how close we are to getting to sleep. Once you notice, I'm about to fall asleep, you kind of wake up. And so this monitoring tends to increase our worry, increase our arousal, and, it's part of this sort of vicious cycle. Third one is misperception of sleep and daytime functioning. People with insomnia, it's sort of very well established, have a tendency, not everyone, but a lot of people, to underestimate how much they actually sleep and overestimate how long it takes them to fall asleep compared to objective measures. And that's also true for the daytime. People tend to overestimate how impaired they are. We can talk more. There's very interesting things in that maybe later. This isn't faking it. It's a genuine perceptual bias, but it feeds into the worry. And one quick last one, unhelpful beliefs about sleep. This is, Charles Morin, I guess it was like about 2000s, 2010, really did some elegant research showing us that we really need to be working with people on unhelpful beliefs about sleep. Now, the traditional sleep CBTI package tries to do this via psychoeducation, and it's clear that that's helpful. But in the cognitive therapy approach, we go much further to be using tools from cognitive therapy. Maybe we'll talk more about it later, but, behavioral experiments are a big approach for helping people with their unhelpful beliefs. Because, you can talk and talk and talk and, get engage people in verbal conversation about their beliefs. But when you invite people to actually engage in experiences, they get that deeper experiential learning that really changes knowledge from head knowledge to heart knowledge. So the behavioral experiments are very powerful.
Can you give us an example of an unhelpful belief about sleep, just so I can wrap my head around it?
Yeah. So, a very common one is the only way I can get more daytime energy is to sleep more.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and, another one might be I need more than 8 hours sleep
Yep.
or I'll be useless tomorrow. Now, if it's a teenager, they really do need more than
Yes.
8 hours sleep. But people say once the brain and body have developed above 26 years of age, then we are more resilient. And even kids, of course, they often get less than that and they can survive.
I was going to say my teenagers, their unhelpful thoughts about sleep is something like I can get by with 2 hours at night.
That's right.
So
Right. Well, that's a good topic for a podcast.
right.
Yes, teenage sleep. Hmm.
Well, I think there's so much that's fascinating about what you've already said, Dr. Harvey, but and I'm really glad that you gave that example of one of the unhelpful beliefs about sleep is I need to get 8 hours or I'm going to be useless. And that's fascinating to me for two reasons. One, that's a thought that comes up all the time. If you ask Dr. Google right now how much sleep you get, that's what he or she is going to tell you.
Yep.
You
Yep.
need 8 hours of sleep. And we can go off on a tangent. The reality is that's not the case. There's a range, right? But people get really caught up on that. But the other piece that's even more fascinating is out of all of those types of worries and concerns that you mentioned, of course, they are very relevant to people with chronic insomnia. But I also think pretty much anybody listening to this episode is going to relate to it in
Mm.
some way because we've all had those thoughts, right? If we have a big event the following morning,
Yep.
we've probably had some of those thoughts. If I don't get sleep tonight, I'm not going to be able to function. My life is over. I have to do everything I can to fall asleep right now. So
Wait, that
many
doesn't
of
help sleep?
you have a lot to learn in this episode,
I'm
Kevin.
still learning. Yep.
But it's fascinating because of course that I imagine that becomes way more extreme when you're dealing with chronic insomnia, but most of us can relate to that even when we have a couple of nights of poor sleep.
Yeah, I love these points, Corinne. We can all fall into this vicious cycle of escalating cognitive processes, escalating arousal, whether or not we have insomnia. And of course, it makes us a bit more vulnerable to having a night of insomnia when we find ourselves trapped in this kind of vicious cycle. But absolutely, and I guess that's why this is just such a wonderful topic because everyone can relate. Almost everyone can relate to these things.
Mhm.
I was just thinking about like the night before a flight somewhere.
Yeah.
I think, if I have to get up early to make sure I hit that flight, I'm not spending the whole evening before like, I'll just relax and I sleep really well. It's always like, okay, what does the clock say? Have I already overslept? I mean, and that's
Right. What if I miss my alarm? Should I set up a backup alarm?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
It's
I can relate in my
fascinating.
own example. Yeah.
Yeah. And that clock watching is really a problem. Believe it or not, like years ago, we did some experiments where we had people clock watching as they were going to sleep versus just monitoring a digit display unit.
Huh.
And the clock watchers were more anxious and actually did worse at estimating their sleep,
Ooh.
probably because they checked the clock. They then fell off to sleep and then checked the clock again and thought that they were awake that whole time because it's hard to perceive that you're asleep, and stage 2 sleep actually feels like wake. If you wake a stage 2 sleeper up, they'll say, what are you doing? I was awake. And rapid eye movement sleep, we're sort of like processing our lives. And so we're often dreaming about something that's happened, and it can feel like worry and rumination and feel like you're awake. So yeah, clock watching is one to assess for and see if people would be willing to put the clocks away.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've clearly got a lot to talk about. You've established some of the most common cognitive issues that come up that are associated with insomnia. So now the question is, what do we do about it? And I'm hoping that you'll share some insider knowledge, at least a few different techniques that we can use to address some of these worries and anxieties.
Yeah, well, for the worry and rumination side, I really recommend the basic cognitive therapy, Judy Beck's excellent book, Christine Podesky's books. Both of them run training courses, just like we do for depression and anxiety. So teaching people to catch and evaluate negative thoughts, introducing sleeping traps. There's certainly more we can talk about there, but perhaps the less disseminated pieces might be, how do we intervene for monitoring for sleep-related threats? I think the first step is explaining the role of monitoring and showing people the different types of monitoring of the body, of the environment that we all do, sort of raising awareness. If people are aware of it, they've got more control over it, because this is a very automatic process. And then we introduce the basic principle that if we look for trouble, we tend to find trouble. And then, working on using behavioral experiments, explicitly reducing checking behaviors, whether it's turning the clock away or turning off scanning the body for tiredness. Now, an example of a behavioral experiment that is super powerful for helping people to turn off the body scanning is either to do it in the session or to do it between sessions. So the within session version, the one I'll describe is, an in-person version, but as we all do telehealth more, you'll see, I think, how this could be adapted. But the in-person version would be to agree that we're going to go for a walk outside, and we'd get some ratings of how both of us, how we're feeling right now on a 1 to 10 scale of how much energy we have, how much tiredness we have, if there are trouble spots like sore shoulders, sore legs, ratings of those. And we'd practice in the office first, like what it would be like to monitor for these internally, and the kinds of questions we'd be, asking ourselves quietly within our own minds. And then what it might be like to actually switch that off and focus externally. So then on the walk, we start with the sort of internal monitoring. And after a couple of minutes, both of us are doing that. We'll stop, we'll get the ratings again. And then we'll do a couple of minutes of walking and externally focusing, smelling the flowers, saying hello to the people walking by, noticing, the clouds or whatever, and then taking some ratings. And it's powerful, after each of these segments, people get that kind of strong demonstration that internal focus is not so helpful. So there's a few examples.
I love that example. It just reminds me of somebody who I'm working with right now, who we were just having the discussion where he was like, well, if I don't track everything, how will I know? If I don't track what my blood pressure is, if I don't track how my muscles feel, how will I know if I'm doing better? And it's that I love the idea of making it into a behavioral experiment, because I can say all day, well, is it helping? Is that really useful? But then actually having the experience of turning that off and seeing what that's like, that's really profound.
Yeah, it's really powerful. It's not easy for everyone to kind of tune into this. It's subtle, but for a lot of people, it's really profound. Another behavioral experiment, just to mention quickly, I guess this one gets at misperception as a cognitive process.
Yeah.
And I think Michael Purlis told me about this one, and we use it all the time. So in the sleep diary, to include a row that gets at daytime energy, so people are tracking throughout the day, maybe just once, maybe twice after lunch and in the evening, their energy. And then when we come back into the session to compare the nights that sleep was poor and the daytime energy, and the nights that sleep was good and the daytime energy. Now, sometimes they match, but look for opportunities when they don't match. And it's pretty common, actually, that they don't match. So then you have the opportunity to say, wow, isn't that so interesting? So there are some nights that we're not sleeping well and we have a high energy day, and some nights when, it's the opposite, then a conversation, what do you think might account for that? And then we can have, a conversation about, well, there's lots of things that influence our daytime energy. Like, have we socialized? Have we had some outdoors time? Have we had, sugary food that sort of made us have a dip in energy? So it loosens up the emphasis that sleep is the only determinant of daytime energy, and loosens up that kind of misperception of daytime functioning.
I was going to ask too, with regards to that misperception of sleep. We know we have a lot of folks that are wearing, wearable devices that are, ostensibly measuring sleep, maybe sleep quality. I don't know, anything from like an actual actigraph to a Fitbit to a smartwatch to whatever. And I know we've talked in the podcast previously about some of the pitfalls, of relying on some of these devices, but at the same time, I think I've heard kind of anecdotally, perhaps, that sometimes there's a role when we can, again, kind of say, well, this is what the sleep monitor is suggesting you're sleeping versus what your perception is. Is that, I can certainly see some problems with that, but at the same time, is there a role?
It's a great question, Kevin. In the old days, we did do a study where we taught people how to compare their ActiWatch data and their sleep diary data as a behavioral experiment. And it was often profound. People go, wow, I actually slept more than I thought I slept. It can really backfire. And we haven't done it with the wearables. And, the wearables, I think, these are like a decade old. It's new technology. And the companies are still honing the algorithm. I mean, the wonderful podcast that you did with a wonderful guest a little while ago on wearables, I thought was outstanding, and refer listeners to that. We tend to say to people, if they're willing, to use the wearable for steps, but put it aside for sleep, because, it can even create insomnia and worry. I mean, the number of emails I get from people saying, I'm not getting REM sleep. What's wrong with me? And it's like, the wearable doesn't track REM sleep very well.
They're giving them new unhelpful beliefs about sleep, right?
Absolutely. And this sort of sleep score that a lot of the watchers, my friends have conversations like, I got a 75 last night. What did you get? And it's like, guys, how did they create that score? Has it been validated? Is it reliable?
What does it even mean?
Right, exactly. So I think, this idea of ortho insomnia, we're creating problems sometimes with these wearables. But if clients are really wedded to their wearable, then we're absolutely flexible and we work out how to use it. We want acceptable treatments, and we'll work alongside whatever makes sense for the client.
I love this. I can keep talking about this forever, because it's so nice to give some ample attention to the cognitive processes, not just the behavioral processes that we're so frequently talking about. And I guess one thing that I'm recognizing even more clearly from our discussion is that they're interrelated. So I don't think we can actually separate so neatly the cognitive from the behavioral, because, logically, I know that there's interplay, but the way that we've been talking about it today makes that even more obvious to me.
Absolutely. Totally part of the same body and system. And when we're doing sleep restriction therapy, are we actually helping people with fear of poor sleep? Like they're
Mm-hmm.
actively choosing to only be in bed for 6 hours this week. And for a lot of people, that's a behavioral experiment where they get to learn I can survive on 6 hours. And actually, I do really well and my sleep improves.
I love that you said that because I imagine, again, because I haven't done a lot of this work practically, clinically, but I imagine even as you're introducing the notion of sleep restriction, a lot of those unhelpful thoughts about sleep are coming up. So, I mean, it's happening all together at the same time. And you're needing to address some of those
Absolutely.
unhelpful thoughts as you're introducing some of those behavioral interventions.
Yep, absolutely. It definitely comes up there for sure.
Well, I'm curious, Dr. Harvey, if you have a particular moment in time or experience in time that has stood out to you in terms of why you're so passionate about this topic.
Mm-hmm.
You may be aware that our theme for this season is what we've been calling kind of impactful moments, asking all of our guests whether they're, what led them to get into this subfield that we're talking about or what led them to be so passionate about things. So I wonder, is there a moment that stands out to you or an experience that stands out to you that has made you really passionate about this?
Yeah, this was a long time ago. I was over at Oxford and I was talking about a patient I was treating with insomnia with David Clark, who was a really valued mentor over there. And he suggested that we do a behavioral experiment, and we did it, and it was really powerful. So it was one of those situations where the client really believed that his energy would drain away progressively across the day. And the only thing he could do to bump it up again was to get a nap or get better sleep tonight. And everything revolved around this at work, doing super easy tasks, canceling social activities, canceling exercise. Everything revolved around his idea of how he would get more sleep. And so he was interested in doing this behavioral experiment to see if sleep is the only determinant of fatigue, daytime fatigue, or if there are other things that might contribute. So his prediction in the behavioral experiment is that after a poor night, he's going to feel terrible and there's absolutely nothing he could do.
Mm-hmm.
And the experiment that we devised was to do as he usually does for 2 days, which is essentially conserve energy. If he hadn't slept well, it's cancel your social activities at night, don't exercise, all of that, versus attempt to generate energy for 2 days. And we had to operationalize what that looked like. So he thought that things that would help him generate energy might be going outside, getting a breath of fresh air, going out and laughing with a friend, having some time socializing, taking a walk, and of course then taking data after the first 2 days and the second 2 days and bringing the data back into the session, or often we ask people to send it over to us soon after the experiment so they don't forget. And, his conclusion, I still remember it, was that tiredness in the day is caused by all kinds of things: sleep, boredom, unrealistic expectations, and worry, and that he can manage tiredness by purposefully generating energy. And so we do this energy generating experiment with a lot of people who have this same set of beliefs. It was a powerful moment in this person's treatment.
That sounds really powerful. Yeah.
I love that. You hit so many levels with that. It's like you addressed the basic cognitions that he had about what generated energy and what he had to do to conserve energy. You also addressed really behavioral activation and social interaction to a large extent of like how he was limiting his life by canceling things, which I'm sure did, made him feel maybe even less energetic, etc. And then in the end, it sounds like he walked away with a much greater sense of control than what he had initially. So this simple sounding tracking of data and little behavioral experiment has so many layers to it.
It really does, yeah. And he walked away with a tool that he can use anytime. I hope he still uses it. And of
Yeah.
course, him and I could have had the conversation about, well, this is something you can do when you're feeling tired. But actually doing it and having that experiential learning is just so
Yeah.
much better than the verbal conversation.
Applies in so many situations too. Just that point, that experiential learning can be a lot deeper and stickier, and last longer than just being logicked into a position, I guess.
Absolutely. And it's relevant to us all when we're, struggling at 2 p.m. Do we go out and get, some candy, or do we walk up and down the stairs?
Right.
We'll probably feel better if we do some sort of, gentle, appropriate for whatever bodies we have, movement.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been such an enlightening conversation. Corinne, you may have done it. You may have made me a
Well, I didn't
listener.
do it. Dr. Harvey did it.
Dr. Harvey, of course, because she's fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. This has been so fantastic. It's been great to meet you and talk to you. We like to end all of our episodes with what we call actionable intel, meaning like after a listener has heard this episode, like what can they apply? What is something that they can take away today? And that can be whether it's, a tip for how can they be more proficient in this area? Are there resources that you would recommend? Is there training people can do? But are there things that they can take away today in their clinical work and apply that would advance their ability to help clients that are struggling with insomnia?
Incoming actionable intel.
Yeah, well, I'll certainly send over some resources.
Fantastic.
And, I'm a big fan of getting basic cognitive therapy training at the Beck Institute or somewhere else, because it's transdiagnostic. It's helpful for sleep and depression, anxiety, and everything. But I think this idea of behavioral experiments, I'd love to kind of leave listeners with, trying to come up with these creative ways collaboratively with the clients, who often have fantastic ideas for a behavioral experiment to try, to test out unhelpful beliefs, to test out cognitive processes, just to say, well, I wonder if this is something we could just try once this week. And people are often willing to try it once. They don't want to kind of bring it into their lives maybe for forever, but are willing to try it just once.
Yeah. And maybe that just once tells us something that does help them bring it into their lives. But
Absolutely. Yeah.
I like that aspect also of when you're thinking about the behavioral experiments, that you're engaging the patient in that process, because I will admit, for me, when I think about doing a behavioral experiment, I feel the pressure of like, I need to be the one to figure out how to operationalize this, what to tell the patient. And that, I don't know where I got that from, but that is not the reality. The reality is, as in most things, the patient is going to have way more information and insight, and I'm just there to sort of coach and guide them. So I appreciate you making that more approachable, even in my mind.
Yeah, I love the way that you put that, Carin. It's really, really wonderful. And James Bennett Levy edited a book back in 2004 on behavioral experiments. There's a chapter for each different disorder, just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. And so it's an old book, but it's highly wonderful and relevant. So it's a good one for folk who might want to check this out a little bit deeper.
We'll include the reference to that book and other resources that Dr. Harvey sent over in the show notes. So check out the show notes for any of that information.
Yes. And of course, we're going to include some of the articles that you have written as well and that you've been cited in, because they're some of my favorite ones to get a nice introduction into this topic. So we will include all that in the show notes. We are just so grateful to have you join us. again, I'm so delighted to finally meet you and to be able to
Same.
chat
Thank
with
you.
you because I've really appreciated your work for so long. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me, Kevin and Corinne. It's just been fun and great to meet you all too.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us again for another episode of Practical for Your Practice. We always want to hear your feedback, so don't be shy. Please get in touch with us. Let us know what you thought of this episode and if there are other topics that you want to hear.
Absolutely. And until then, stay curious.
And mind your EBPs.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Be sure to subscribe to Practical for Your Practice to be notified when new episodes arrive. Our theme music is Failed Attempts by Nitro, and our administrative assistant is Bree Mercer. This podcast is produced by CDP at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of War, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of War, or the U.S. government.